Hello, I'm Anna Maria Tremonti, and this is The Current. For most Canadians, the war in Afghanistan centers on the southern province of Kandahar. This is the area where the Taliban has been the most active and, for Canadian troops, deadly. There are now reports that insurgents are both organizing and attacking in Afghanistan's northern regions, and that's troubling because the north has widely been considered relatively stable, an area most recently claimed by the Northern Alliance, which toppled the Taliban regime with help from the U.S. in 2001. James Sadler is the security coordinator for Vigilant Strategic Services Afghanistan, and he's been keeping tabs on these attacks. We have reached him in Mazar-e-Sharif, Afghanistan. Hello.
Hi.
What is your data telling you about the number of attacks being carried out by insurgents around Afghanistan?
Well, year on year, we started compiling numbers in late 2006, and the 2007-2008 numbers are showing there's been a marked increase in anti-governmental element attacks throughout the country. But the main areas are in the south, southeast and eastern regions of Afghanistan.
The southeast and eastern regions are likely not surprising. That's really a Taliban area, is it not?
That's correct. The most active areas for the Taliban are all the areas bordering the Pakistan border with Afghanistan.
You make the point that most of it is in the south and the southeast, but there have been reports of insurgents increasing their activity in northern Afghanistan. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there was a major offensive last year by NATO in the heavily affected areas, again, the southeast and eastern regions. And they've displaced a number of Taliban fighters and pushed them to the western areas and to the north. So those areas are like the western region of Afghanistan, so Herat, Baghdad and Ghor provinces, and also to some extent the northeast. So in provinces such as Baghlan and Kunduz. Their main tactics are through roadside IEDs or vehicle-borne IEDs, suicide bombers, and to a lesser extent, complex attacks and small arms fire attacks. Because they can't fight NATO openly, so they've resorted to guerrilla tactics.
Are there other insurgency groups that are operating out of the north who are not considered Taliban?
Actually, there's a number of groups in the northern area. The main cause of instability, actually, is crime and the drug trade. In the northeastern region, there's a terrorist organisation called Hizb Islami, or HIG, and their main area of operation is basically in Kunduz, Baghlan area, and towards the east of Afghanistan. And they fight alongside the Taliban on occasions, but they generally fight their own jihad here in Afghanistan against, as they see, the foreign invaders.
So they are ideological as well, or you mentioned the fact that there's a lot of crime and drug groups too. Are they intersecting with those groups?
Yes, they are. In terms of proxy attacks. The Taliban, well, we think the Taliban may be using criminal gangs to carry out some attacks where they don't have much influence in order to destabilise the north.
How strategic is the north for the Taliban?
I think for the Taliban to have major influence in the north would be very, very strategic for them, as they would show the weakness of the central government to have control over supposedly a quiet area of Afghanistan. So I think if they can cause more destabilisation, it goes towards showing that the central government is very weak, along with the international community as well.
So what is being done to take on the insurgency in the north with all of its tentacles?
Well, actually last week there was a NATO operation on the border of the northern the northern region, in the Baghdad and Ghor provinces in the western region of Afghanistan, NATO operation there. as they received information that up to 30 Taliban were staging in that province.
Is this a scenario you would have envisioned 2 years ago even?
No, not really. Over the last 2 years, incidents have certainly increased, and I think it was due to apathy on the part of the international community, not really realising that the Taliban were coming back in force.
And so, in order to try to stop that greater flow into other parts of the country, what do you think needs to be done?
There are a number of issues in Afghanistan which preclude safety and security, I guess. A big issue for the local population is good governance and corruption within the actual central government and its government arms, such as the police. I think if we can, the international community can focus on that, as well as development, it'll go a long way to improving the situation on the ground. Okay,
well, James Sadler, thanks for speaking with me today. Bye-bye.
Bye.
James Sadler is Security Coordinator for Vigilant Strategic Services in Afghanistan. He was in Mazar-e-Sharif, Afghanistan. Well, if the anti-government insurgency in Afghanistan is spreading to areas once thought to be relatively secure and insulated from Taliban influence, the big question is why. Mark Sedra knows a lot about the security situation there. He is a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. He's also the co-author of Afghanistan, Arms and Conflict: Armed Groups, Disarmament and Security in a Post-War Society. And Mark Sedra joins me in our Toronto studio. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, what do you think of James Sadler's assessment of Taliban activity in the north?
Well, we certainly do see the growth of Taliban activity outside of the traditional areas, the Pashtun Belt in southern and eastern Afghanistan. For instance, but it's not just limited to the north. We actually look in central Afghanistan too. Certain areas that only a few years ago, aid agencies, the UN agencies, could operate quite openly in some provinces, but now they're really limited just to main roads and the main towns and urban centers.
So it really has changed in how long a period?
Well, we're talking really since 2006, the summer of 2006, we start to see the growth of this activity outside of the south and east, but we're really seeing it reach a higher intensity in recent months.
And I understand you had your own experience about the human cost of this war. Your co-author was killed just last week.
Yes, my co-author, Michael Bachia, who was working with the U.S. military in eastern Afghanistan and Khost, he was part of a human terrain team, which are groups of social scientists, primarily anthropologists, that work in providing information to the U.S. military operating there on the political and social dynamics of the areas that they're operating in. He was unfortunately killed in a roadside bomb while traveling to a meeting.
And is it clear who would have put that bomb there?
It's most likely the Taliban or Hizb Islami, but that information hasn't really come to light as of yet.
So what can you tell us about the Taliban and other anti-government groups that are operating in Afghanistan now?
Well, one thing is we've really seen what many people are referring to, the Iraqization of the insurgency in Afghanistan. We're starting to see the transformation of tactics, many migrating from Iraq. For instance, the increased use of suicide bombing, the increased focus on civilians, the use of tactics, some horrific tactics, such as beheadings and so on. These things are relatively new to the Afghan conflict and are really growing in intensity. So this we see is perhaps an effect from al-Qaeda's influence on Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda, in a sense, is providing what you can refer to as a jihadi bridge between the Iraq conflict and the Afghanistan conflict, and providing more and more resources and influence in the insurgency in Afghanistan.
And so why, first of all, is it spreading?
Well, the Taliban, we have to be honest about this, are growing in strength. The U.S. military and many in the Afghan government would like to say that every new large-scale attack by the Taliban is a sign of desperation. This is nothing but spin. The reality is that the Taliban is growing in strength in terms of its resource base, the numbers of fighters that it has access to and are working with it, and in terms of the number of people who are gravitating to the Taliban. People are frustrated frustrated with the government. They're frustrated with the lack of governance, the corruption, and the lack of security that is available in these areas. And they're thinking nostalgically about the Taliban period, because, of course, that was a period. One thing the Taliban were able to provide during their rule is security.
Well, in fact, the argument is the Taliban got as far as it did in the 90s because of the corruption of all of the warlords and because of that ongoing fighting that plagued Afghanistan for so long.
Exactly. We have to remember that, for instance, Kabul was largely leveled during the intra-Mujahideen civil war, not during the Soviet period, but when the Mujahideen factions, many of whom are warlords today in Afghanistan, were fighting over the spoils, fighting over political power in Kabul. So many Afghans have very bitter memories of many of these political figures who now have prominent positions in the Afghan government.
So where are these guys getting their weapons these days?
A variety of sources. Of course, Afghanistan is awash with weaponry from 30 years of conflict, but you also see weapons continue to flow across the border from Pakistan. The U.S. military claims that some weapons are also flowing across the border from Iran. So there are certainly some weapons are internally being provided, some externally. An interesting dynamic we see actually in Afghanistan today is the fact that some weapons are actually flowing from the north down to the south. In other words, from the Taliban's former enemies, the Northern Alliance, being funneled to the Taliban. And this is really an effect that we see from the demilitarization process that's taking place right now, because the Afghan government...
sponsored by the United Nations?
Exactly.
So connect the dots here for us. What does that mean?
The Afghan government is collecting weapons in northern Afghanistan, but it's not providing direct compensation for soldiers to provide their weapons or militiamen to provide their weapons. So many of these militiamen are saying, well, if I have to give my weapons up for free, I'd rather actually sell them on the black market. And many are being sold to middlemen who are then transporting them to the south to sell them to their former enemies, the Taliban.
Wow. And so the UN obviously has to know this is going on.
Well, it certainly has come out in the media, but I don't think that there is wide recognition of the need to really address this problem.
And what should they do? They should be collecting them, paying for them, and destroying them, I guess.
Well, I think the current program, which is called the Disbandment of Illegal Armed Groups program, is clearly faltering. And I think that there's a need to really reconceptualize the program to determine what will it take to actually succeed in bringing different armed groups on board and collecting those weapons effectively.
Okay, that may be where they're getting their guns. Where are they getting all the explosives for these improvised explosive devices?
Well, we have to remember that Afghanistan is one of the most heavily mined countries in the world, again, after 30 years of conflict. Much of this explosive material is being harvested from mines that are located across the country.
They're literally picking it out and remaking it.
Literally picking them out. But also there are ammunition and mines and arms caches, secret caches or secret storage facilities throughout the country that really are one-stop shops to gain this type of explosive material, which are then used for these types of improvised explosive devices, which unfortunately killed my colleague in Afghanistan.
Now, we know about the arguments of corruption, and you've already mentioned this. There are also reports of widespread corruption in the forces that are supposed to be working with the NATO troops, police in particular. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the police in Afghanistan today is probably the most dysfunctional institution in the country. I would say that maybe 50 to 70% of the police are involved in some level in the drug trade. The police are seen by the majority of the Afghan population as predatory rather than a source of protection. They see them as a source of corruption. So often the only interaction most Afghans will have with the police is at a roadside checkpoint, an illegal checkpoint, I should mention, where they are extorting money from innocent civilians. If you ask any Afghan, you said, would you go to, if you were a victim of a crime, what would you do? Very few, if none, would actually go to the police. So this is causing a crisis of confidence, not only in the security institutions, but in the wider state itself.
Okay, now you have just come back from, you were in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. You spent a lot of time there. How does this, what you're saying now, how does this affect what Canada's doing there?
Well, I think Canada has to be aware that the linchpin for success here is reforming institutions like the police. But on a wider level, it's improving governance. The reality is that many Afghans are starting to gravitate to the Taliban, as I said, because of frustration. They're gravitating to the Taliban in the south not because they support the Taliban ideology, but they believe momentum is on the Taliban's side, for one, and because they're so frustrated with the lack of, or the inability, I should say, of the government to provide basic public goods, basic services, most importantly, security.
You have spoken to senior people at the National Security Council in Washington. What's the view there?
Well, interestingly, I think there is a growing awareness in Washington, which is a change, of the need to start to reach out and negotiate with the Taliban, that a negotiated solution, not an outright military victory, is the only sustainable outcome in the Afghanistan conflict. I think this is very positive. Where I am worried, and I see this coming out of news reports in Canada and particularly in Britain, is talk of NATO, talk of international military forces and donors reaching out to the Taliban unilaterally. This is a mistake. There is a democratically elected Afghan government which is working very hard to establish its legitimacy in the country, and it is not the role of international actors to reach out to the Taliban themselves. It is the role of the Afghan government. If international actors do this, you're only undermining the legitimacy of the Afghan government, which is what we've spent billions of dollars and lost so many lives trying to establish.
So you're saying that international troops and the governments behind them should quietly support the government of Hamid Karzai to try to cut a deal and cobble together some kind of other government?
Precisely. I don't know if it's to provide some sort of new government, but really to work to bring moderate Taliban into the administration. There is an Afghan-led program which is focused on bringing moderate Taliban out of the cold and to provide them amnesties, but it hasn't really had the robust financial and political support of the international community. The international community behind the scenes should be supporting these processes. We shouldn't be leading them. So we should be supporting them with political capital, and we should be supporting them with resources.
Okay, well, Mark Sedra, thanks for your thoughts today.
Thank you very much.
Mark Sedra is the co-author with the late Michael Bhatia of Afghanistan, Arms and Conflict, Armed Groups, Disarmament and Security in a Post-War Society, and he was in our Toronto studio. You are listening to The Current on CBC Radio 1 and Sirius Satellite Radio 137. I'm Anna Maria Tremonti. Well, for more on NATO's evolving role in Afghanistan in light of the changing security situation, I'm joined by Robert Hunter. He was the U.S. ambassador to NATO under former President Bill Clinton. Today, he's a senior advisor at the RAND Corporation, and he joins us from Washington. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Well, when we talk about the northern region of Afghanistan, just remind us, who's in charge with NATO? Which countries are there?
Well, the principal country is Germany. It's got about 3,000 troops there, but there are a number of others, particularly the ones that were not prepared to go to the south and the east, where we, despite the added tensions and killings in other parts of the country, is where the major fighting takes place. Canada is very prominently there. In fact, has taken more casualties than any war since Korea. The Americans, the British, the Poles, the Dutch in particular, and the Estonians. These are the ones who are doing most of the fighting for NATO.
How has the increase in the violence changed NATO's operations as the violence has shown up in other places where the ones you've mentioned are not? How has it changed things for NATO?
Well, clearly, NATO has a responsibility under a UN resolution and with having taken over the leadership of the International Security Assistance Force, to try to help the Afghans produce as much security as possible throughout the country. The problems that NATO has is having enough troops which they can take enough places with the right kinds of equipment and with various countries within NATO willing to do the fighting that has to be done. This is kind of the big problem. Not enough troops, not enough equipment, and too many of what they're called caveats. That is, I won't go here, I won't go there.
And we've certainly seen at the NATO meeting in Bucharest, we've seen countries try to convince those countries with the caveats to change, but it's not changing, is it?
Not really. There's a little bit here and there. At Bucharest, the Germans continued to say that there were things they just can't do in various parts of the country, military operations they can't get involved in. They have a particular problem, the Germans, going back to World War II. The real question is whether the NATO allies as a whole will recognize that they all made a decision with their eyes wide open, that the future of the alliance does in some respects depend upon seeing this through, and to put in more effort. Now, it may well be that some countries, for domestic reasons, simply can't do more military effort. After all, Afghanistan is an awful long way away from any of our countries. But in which case, in my judgment, they need to put more effort into the areas we've been hearing about from your other callers, namely to work on questions of good governance, where the Kabul government has to take the lead, but also in terms of stabilization, economic development, help people with infrastructure, to help do the things that will improve the lives of the average Afghan, so that the average Afghan will himself or herself push back against the Taliban. Here, there is woeful inadequacy, and here, frankly, in my judgment, the European Union is under a test, which it is failing, to put in the kinds of things that will really succeed in Afghanistan, namely, how does the average Afghan see his or her life improving?
I'm wondering how you react to the idea that the Northern Alliance, which helped topple the Taliban regime with the help of the U.S. in 2001, is now selling guns and part of the problem in the North.
The country has been full of warlords for a long time, and different groups, two fundamental linguistic groups, ethnic groups. You wonder, in fact, whether Afghanistan is a country that has any true coherence to be managed from Kabul itself. That's something that's way beyond our capacity to judge. But what we can do is be working on the strengthening of governance, whether it's done at the province level or at the Kabul level. And when I say governments, I mean dealing with issues of corruption, dealing with serious police training, getting police who are not fundamentally corrupt. It's been done successfully elsewhere, like in Georgia. It requires a lot of resources, a lot of sensitivity from outsiders, and a lot of people who know what they're doing, many of which are not military, most of which are not military, many of which are non-governmental organizations, but who need security to a great extent provided by NATO and the countries that are associated with NATO.
Now, what do you think about NATO talking to the Taliban? We heard our last guest say that it should just be supporting perhaps Hamid Karzai's government speaking with the Taliban. Where do you fall on that?
Well, if the president of Afghanistan decides that having conversations with the Taliban are useful to his country and to its security, that's his business. But under no circumstances should NATO even been hinting that is something which is a preferred option. Now, as your previous caller said, your previous guest said, bringing individuals in from the cold is perfectly all right, because, quite frankly, there is no thing called the Taliban in which 100% of the people sheltering under that banner are fully committed. Getting people to, let's say, defect, if that's the right word, come back into mainstream Afghan society, there's high potential for that. But in terms of dealing with the leadership, that's something we should rigorously stay clear of.
Do you think in terms of victory for NATO in Afghanistan, or is there something else that NATO should be striving for? Should it be called something else?
Well, victory is going to be for the Afghan people, and that is going to be to have a life that is better than it was under the Soviets, and frankly, better than it was under the Taliban, in which there were some things the Taliban got right. There was almost no poppy production because they went out and killed people who were involved in it. At the London meeting in 2006, the so-called London Compact, there were 5 areas, 3 of which were undertaken the leadership for by European countries. The British were going to take the lead in dealing with the poppies, the Germans with police training, and the Italians with reform of the judiciary. All 3 efforts have failed, not only by the lead nations, but others supporting. And everybody who goes to Afghanistan, beginning with the military commanders, would say, you've got to deal with these particular problems of Afghan society so that they, at some point, will say, we have won, we run our country and our lives.
Robert Hunter, thanks for your thoughts today.
Thank you.
Robert Hunter was the U.S. ambassador to NATO under President Clinton. He spoke to us from Washington. Stay with us on CBC Radio 1. Sounds like Canada is next, and there will be a road trip across Canada and the U.S. that reveals the overwhelming influence cars have on our lives. Right now, though, I'm about to say something to make you feel old, so my apologies in advance. It was 10 years ago today that the show about nothing ended. The final episode of Seinfeld aired May 14th, 1998. That was the sitcom world of soup Nazis, double dippers, puffy shirt wearers, and low talkers, all part of what many consider to be the greatest sitcom of all time. And the last episode was the 3rd most watched television finale ever, just behind those of MASH and Cheers. But all that popularity wasn't enough to convince CNN's Larry King, who interviewed Jerry Seinfeld a few months ago and asked him how the show came to an end, whether it had been canceled. Seinfeld's reaction was worthy of George Costanza's dad. We'll leave you today with that bit of history. I'm Anna Maria Tremonti. Thanks for listening.
Lasted how long?
9 years, 180 episodes.
You gave it up, right?
I did. So.
They didn't cancel you. You canceled them.
You're not aware of this?
No, I'm asking you.
You think I got canceled? Are you under the impression that I got canceled?
Have I hurt you, Jerry?
I thought that was pretty well documented.
Is
this still CNN? I was the #1 show on television, Larry. Do you know who I am?
Jewish guy, Brooklyn.
Yes.
Okay.
75 million viewers. Last episode.
What? You don't take it so bad.
Well, that's the big difference between being canceled and being #1.
Okay, I'm sorry. We'll be right back.
Jeez.
B-movie opens. B-movie opens.
Can we get a resume in here for me?
B-movie opens tomorrow.
Go over?
We'll be right back.